On the morning of August 14, 1982, 21 commercial fishermen left Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, in 6 separate boats and disappeared into the murky waters of the Gulf of Mexico. By sunset that same day, all 21 men lay dead across 30 square miles of Louisiana wetlands. All adults, all eliminated with shotguns and rifles over a 12-hour period. The perpetrators, the Boudreaux family clan, working together like a coordinated strike force across multiple boats and marsh channels. The Louisiana State Police would later call it the most systematic maritime massacre in Gulf Coast history. But the reason behind the bloodshed wasn't drugs, wasn't organized crime, wasn't even a generations-old feud between fishing families. It was a single missing crab trap worth maybe $40 that vanished from Barataria Bay on August 12th. And one man's unshakable belief that in the Louisiana marshes, you settled your own debts because the law was too far away and too slow to matter. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, stretched across 845 square miles of some of the most unforgiving wetland terrain in the American South in 1982. The Mississippi River Delta spread like fingers into the Gulf of Mexico, creating a maze of channels, bayous, and islands that changed with every storm season. Population stood around 26,000, scattered across fishing villages and oil rig communities that felt more connected to the Gulf than to the rest of Louisiana. The parish seat, Pointe-à-la-Hache, held barely 3,000 souls who made their living from the water, one way or another. August in the Louisiana Delta meant temperatures climbing to 95 degrees by noon, humidity so thick you could taste the salt in every breath. The air smelled like crude oil from offshore rigs, mixed with the sweet decay of marsh grass and the metallic tang of brackish water that never quite decided if it was fresh or salt. At night, when fog rolled in from the Gulf, you could hear shrimp boats working in the darkness, their diesel engines rumbling across water that stretched to the horizon. Sound traveled strange in those marshes. Sometimes you'd hear a boat engine 5 miles away, clear as if it were beside you. Other times you wouldn't hear an airboat until it was close enough to touch. But 1982 was a devastating year for Louisiana fishermen. The oil industry that had brought prosperity to the Gulf Coast was in collapse. Offshore drilling platforms that had employed thousands now sat abandoned, their crews laid off, their support boats tied up at docks with no work to do. The fishing industry that had sustained families for generations was being squeezed from all sides. Shrimp prices had dropped to levels that barely covered fuel costs. Crab and oyster beds were showing signs of contamination from industrial runoff. And everywhere you looked, men who'd worked the water their entire lives were watching their livelihoods slip away to economic forces beyond their control. In that economic wasteland, every crab trap, every fishing spot, every piece of equipment represented survival, not just income, but the difference between feeding your family and watching them go hungry. The marshes provided everything needed for those who knew how to work them. Hidden channels where law enforcement rarely ventured, endless maze of waterways known only to locals who'd navigated them since childhood, and an unwritten code that said you handled your own problems because help was always too far away. The sheriff's department was understaffed and underfunded. State Marine Patrol had 3 boats to cover thousands of square miles of coastal waters. Coast Guard presence was focused on offshore oil rigs and shipping channels. In Plaquemines Parish, especially in the remote fishing camps scattered through the Delta, the law was more theoretical than real. Jean-Baptiste Boudreaux was 48 years old that August, though the Louisiana sun and salt air had aged him to look closer to 60. 6 feet tall but bent forward from 3 decades spent hunched over crab traps and shrimp nets. His hands were scarred and permanently stained dark from handling rope and bait, fingers twisted from arthritis that came from working in cold water before dawn every day for 30 years. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, gray now instead of the black it had been when he started fishing. He walked with the rolling gait of a man who'd spent more time on boat decks than solid ground. Every morning, Jean-Baptiste woke at 4:30 in his house on stilts overlooking Bayou Perot. He'd make coffee in a percolator so old the bottom was dented from years of use, strong and black with chicory that burned your throat going down. He'd sit on his porch in the darkness, listening to the water lap against the pilings, watching for the first hint of dawn over the marsh. He'd smoke 2 cigarettes, hand-rolled with tobacco he bought in bulk, and then he'd climb down to his boat, a 28-foot Lafitte skiff named Marie Claire after his wife who died of cancer 3 years earlier. Jean-Baptiste had been working these waters since he was 14 years old. His father had taught him to read the tides, to know where the crabs moved with the seasons, to navigate channels that looked identical to outsiders, but held subtle differences that could mean the difference between a good day and coming home empty-handed. This wasn't just work for Jean-Baptiste. This was inheritance, tradition, survival, all rolled into the smell of diesel fuel and the sound of water against aluminum hull. He owned 47 crab traps, each one representing weeks of work and money he couldn't afford to lose. That wire and rope represented everything: his independence, his ability to feed his remaining family, his connection to a way of life that stretched back generations. The traps themselves had cost him nearly $2,000, assembled piece by piece over 2 years of saving every dollar he could spare. In Plaquemines Parish, where legitimate work was disappearing and desperation was becoming the norm, those 47 traps were Jean-Baptiste's lifeline to survival. The Thibodeau family had been working these same waters for just as long. Marcel Thibodeau was 52, captain of his own boat, father of 4 sons who worked the water with him. They weren't criminals by nature, weren't part of any organized operation. They were fishermen, like hundreds of others scattered across the Louisiana Delta, trying to make a living from waters that had sustained their families for generations. Marcel's oldest son, André, was 28, married with 2 young children. His youngest, Paul, was barely 19, still learning the trade, still believing he could make a decent life from the Gulf. These weren't enemies in the traditional sense. The Boudreau and Thibodeau families had crossed paths for decades, bought fuel at the same docks, sold their catch to the same buyers, nodded to each other at the occasional community gathering. They weren't friends, but they weren't feuding either. Just neighbors in the Louisiana sense, aware of each other's existence, occasionally sharing information about where the crabs were running or which channels had been blocked by storm debris. But on August 12, 1982, something changed. Jean-Baptiste made his usual run to check his traps, following a route he'd used for 15 years. He worked his way through the maze of channels in Barataria Bay, checking each location where he'd set wire cages baited with chicken necks and fish heads. 46 traps accounted for, each one exactly where he'd left it. But trap number 47, the one he'd set near a small island locals called Pelican Point, was gone. Not damaged by storms, not tangled in boat propellers, gone. Vanished like it had never existed, leaving only the concrete block he'd used as anchor and the memory of where it should have been. Jean-Baptiste circled that spot for 20 minutes, checking his GPS coordinates, verifying his position. He'd been setting traps in this exact location for 8 years. He knew every oyster shell and piece of driftwood. The trap was simply gone. Standing in his boat, staring at empty water where $40 worth of wire and rope should have been, Jean-Baptiste felt something cold settle in his chest. This wasn't weather damage. This wasn't accident. Someone had deliberately taken what belonged to him. In the economic climate of 1982, with families struggling to survive, that trap represented more than equipment. It represented food, rent money, respect. The principle that a man's work meant something. Jean-Baptiste could have reported it to the Marine Patrol, could have filed a complaint with the sheriff's office, could have written it off as the cost of doing business in waters where gear sometimes disappeared. But he'd grown up in these marshes, raised on stories of how his grandfather had handled problems when the law was even further away than it was now. In Plaquemines Parish, especially in the remote fishing camps, you settled your own disputes because help was always too far away and too slow to matter. Word traveled through the fishing community like ripples across still water. By sunset on August 12th, everyone from Grand Isle to Venice knew that Jean-Baptiste Boudreau's trap had gone missing near Pelican Point. By the next morning, 3 different people had mentioned seeing Marcel Thibodeau's boat in that area the day before. Not accusations, just observations, the kind of casual information sharing that happened in small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. Jean-Baptiste didn't confront Marcel directly. Instead, he asked around quietly, the way fishermen do when they're trying to piece together what happened on the water. He learned that Marcel had been having a particularly bad season, that his usual spots weren't producing, that his oldest son André had mentioned needing to find new areas to work. He learned that the Thibodeau boat had been seen near Pelican Point not once, but twice in the past week, unusual for a family that typically worked different waters. The evidence was circumstantial, built on observations and assumptions rather than facts. But in a community where your reputation and your word were all you had, Circumstantial evidence often carried the weight of proof. Jean-Baptiste had made his decision by the morning of August 13th. He would give Marcel Thibodeau one chance to make things right, one opportunity to return what had been taken and avoid the consequences that would follow if he refused. At 2:30 in the afternoon on August 13th, Jean-Baptiste found Marcel Thibodeau at the fuel dock in Bourras, topping off his tanks before heading out for an evening run. The two men stood on the floating dock, diesel fumes mixing with the smell of dead fish and creosote pilings, while Jean-Baptiste made his accusation and his offer. "Marcel, someone took my trap from Pelican Point." Jean-Baptiste's voice was calm, controlled. "Figure you might know something about that." Marcel looked up from the fuel pump, his face showing nothing but mild confusion. "Don't know nothing about your trap, Jean-Baptiste. Been working my own areas." Jean-Baptiste studied the older man's face, looking for signs of deception, for the tell that would confirm what he already suspected. "You were seen in that area twice this week. Unusual for you to be working my spots. Just because I was in the area doesn't mean I took nothing." Marcel's voice carried a slight edge now, the tone of a man who didn't like being accused. Lots of boats work those waters. Jean-Baptiste felt the conversation slipping away from him, felt the opportunity for peaceful resolution disappearing like morning fog burning off the marsh. "I'm giving you until tomorrow night, Marcel. Sunset on August 14th. Return my trap, and we forget this happened. Don't return it, and we settle this the old way." Marcel straightened up, understanding exactly what the old way meant in these waters. "You threatening me, Jean-Baptiste?" "I'm giving you fair warning," Jean-Baptiste said. "Mountain rules. Marsh rules. You know them same as me. Man takes another man's livelihood. That debt gets settled." He turned and walked back to his boat, didn't look back. 3 witnesses heard the entire exchange. By evening, everyone in the fishing community knew that Jean-Baptiste Boudreau and Marcel Thibodeau were headed for trouble, but people had been predicting conflicts in these waters for generations. Mostly it was talk. Mostly men backed down before things went too far. What Marcel Thibodeau didn't know was that his refusal to admit taking the trap would set in motion a chain of events that would leave 21 men dead across the Louisiana marshes in less than 24 hours. What he didn't know was that Jean-Baptiste had 6 grown sons and 4 nephews, all experienced with boats and firearms, all raised on the code that said you protected family and settled your own debts. What he didn't know was that tomorrow would transform a simple dispute over fishing equipment into the worst massacre in Louisiana maritime history. The deadline would come and go like a stone dropping into dark water, and when it did, Jean-Baptiste Boudreau would discover exactly how far he was willing to go to defend the principle that in these forgotten corners of America, a man's word and a man's work still meant something worth fighting for. The deadline came and went like a stone dropping into dark water. August 14th, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Jean-Baptiste Boudreau stood on his dock watching the sun sink toward the western marsh, and the crab trap remained gone. No boat pulled up to his property. No phone call came. No Thibodeau appeared to make things right. Just silence and the slow understanding that Marcel had made his choice. Marie Boudreau appeared in the doorway behind him, drying her hands on a dish towel. "Maybe he doesn't have it, Jean-Baptiste. Maybe you're wrong about this whole thing." Jean-Baptiste didn't turn around. "I'm not wrong. The trap didn't grow legs and walk away. Then call the Marine Patrol. Let the law handle it. Marine Patrol's 40 miles away in New Orleans. By the time they file paperwork and investigate, if they even bother, that trap could be anywhere. Besides," Marie finally looked at her, "you know how this works. Water handles water business." Marie's face went pale. She knew what that meant. Everyone in Plaquemines Parish knew what that meant. "Jean-Baptiste, please think about the boys. I am thinking about the boys. What kind of man lets someone steal from his family and does nothing? What kind of father teaches his sons that you can be robbed and just accept it?" He turned back to watch the sunset. "I gave fair warning. Rest is on them." Marie went back inside. Jean-Baptiste heard her crying in the kitchen but didn't follow. Some decisions you make alone. 3 days earlier, on the Thursday before everything fell apart, Jean-Baptiste had driven into Bourras with his youngest son, Philippe. They'd gone to the marine supply store for rope, stopped at the post office, grabbed lunch at the diner on Highway 23. Normal things, father and son running errands like they'd done 100 times before. Philippe was 22, still young enough to believe the future held something better than Plaquemines Parish's slow economic decline. He'd been talking about moving to Houston, maybe getting work on an offshore rig, maybe finding steady wages and benefits that fishing couldn't provide. The oil companies promised good money for men willing to work dangerous jobs in dangerous places. They sat in a booth at the back of the diner, red vinyl cracked and patched with duct tape, ceiling fan wobbling overhead. The place smelled like fried seafood and weak coffee. Philippe ordered a shrimp po' boy. Jean-Baptiste got the red beans and rice, same thing he always got. "Dad," Philippe said, stirring sugar into his iced tea, "you think I should take that job in Houston? I mean, the fishing's not getting any better." Jean-Baptiste chewed slowly, thinking. Outside the window, Highway 23 sat mostly empty. Half the businesses were boarded up. Even the bank had reduced its hours to 3 days a week because there wasn't enough commerce to justify staying open. "I think," Jean-Baptiste said finally, "a man does what he has to do to take care of himself. If the oil rigs give you a future, then yeah, you should go." He met his son's eyes. "But you remember where you come from. Remember what matters. Family, honor, your word. Don't let them strip that out of you working for some corporation." Philippe nodded seriously. "I won't, Dad." Jean-Baptiste smiled, reached across and squeezed his son's shoulder. "You're a good boy, Philippe. Going to make something of yourself." That was Thursday afternoon. On Sunday, Jean-Baptiste discovered the trap was gone. On Monday, he confronted Marcel Thibodeau. And now, Tuesday evening, Philippe would be helping load shotguns into the back of his father's boat, his future in Houston evaporating before it even began. The preparation started Wednesday morning. Jean-Baptiste woke before dawn and drove to his brother-in-law's place 12 miles down the bayou near Triumph. Claude Hebert was 58, retired from offshore work with a back injury that kept him on permanent disability, but he still maintained an impressive collection of firearms. Relics from better times when men hunted to feed their families and bought quality weapons they could pass down to sons and grandsons. Claude sat on his porch, back brace visible under his shirt, breathing carefully through the pain that never quite went away. Jean-Baptiste, awful early for visiting. "Need to borrow some hardware, Claude." The old man's eyes narrowed. He'd lived in these parishes long enough to understand what hardware meant at 5:30 in the morning. "This about that trap? Thibodeau stole from me. I gave them a chance to make it right. They chose wrong." Claude was quiet for a long time, shifting in his chair to find a position that didn't aggravate his injured spine. Finally, "How many you need?" "Enough for 10 men. "Jesus, Jean-Baptiste. You sure about this?" "They crossed the line, Claude. I can't let it stand." Claude struggled to his feet, shuffled inside. Came back 10 minutes later with 2 shotguns. A Remington 870 in 12 gauge and a Mossberg 500. "These are yours to keep. Consider them a gift." But Jean-Baptiste, he gripped his brother-in-law's arm with surprising strength. "You do this, there's no coming back. You understand that?" "I understand. Your boys will go to federal prison. You'll die in prison. Marie will be alone." "I know." Claude let go, shaking his head. Thibodeau should have returned that trap. Over the next 3 days, Jean-Baptiste quietly assembled an arsenal. His own hunting rifle, a Remington 700 in 30.06. His oldest son, Jerome, had a Winchester 12-gauge shotgun. Antoine owned a .357 Magnum revolver he'd bought at a pawn shop in New Orleans. Michelle had inherited their grandfather's Springfield 30.06 from Korea. The nephews, Louis, Robert, Charles, and Paul, all had hunting weapons accumulated over years of duck season and target practice. Jean-Baptiste didn't buy anything new, didn't need to. This was Louisiana, where every household owned guns the way city people owned umbrellas, necessary tools for a harsh environment. But he did buy ammunition, 5 boxes of 12-gauge buckshot, 3 boxes of 30.06, 2 boxes of .357, and 100 rounds of .22 long rifle for the smaller weapons. He spread the purchases across 4 different stores, one in Bellechasse, one in Port Sulphur, one in Venice, one in Empire. Paid cash, kept the receipts in a coffee can under the kitchen sink. Some part of him still believed in documentation, in proving he'd done things legally right up until the moment he didn't. Thursday afternoon, Jean-Baptiste spread nautical charts across his kitchen table. Charts from the Coast Guard, showing every channel, bayou, and shallow watermark in southeastern Plaquemines Parish. He'd been navigating these waters since he was 14 years old. Knew them in daylight, knew them in fog, knew them in storms. But planning required precision. He marked the Thibodeau camp with a red X, marked the escape routes with yellow highlighter, marked where each of his boats would position themselves with blue circles. Jerome stood beside him studying the charts. "This is military, Dad, like Vietnam. Vietnam taught me how to stay alive when people were trying to kill me," Jean-Baptiste said. "Taught me patience, taught me that emotion gets you caught, but planning gets you home." He tapped the chart. "We do this right. Nobody gets hurt that doesn't deserve it. And if they have weapons, if they fight back," Jean-Baptiste looked at his oldest son, "then we fight harder." At that moment, while Jean-Baptiste Boudreau and his sons planned in their kitchen, Marcel Thibodeau was working late in his boat shed, rebuilding an engine that had been giving him trouble all season, completely unaware that 10 men had decided he and his entire family were marked for elimination. The impact wrench screamed. Zydeco music played on a paint-splattered radio. His youngest son, Paul, brought him a sandwich around 7. Normal Thursday evening, normal life. He went to bed that night thinking about the engine job, about whether he could get it running by Saturday, about the fuel costs that were eating into profits. He didn't think about Jean-Baptiste Boudreau at all. Friday evening, Jean-Baptiste sat alone in his boat shed. The building smelled like motor oil, old rope, and the accumulated salt of 30 years. A single work light hung from a beam, casting long shadows. On the workbench in front of him lay his Remington 700, disassembled for cleaning. His hands moved automatically, bore brush, cleaning rod, solvent, patches. He'd cleaned this rifle 1,000 times, knew every scratch in the stock, every wear mark on the barrel. His father had used this rifle to hunt deer every winter from 1952 until the heart attack took him in 1978. Jean-Baptiste had inherited it, used it to put food on the table during the lean seasons when the fishing was poor. Now he was about to use it for something his father never imagined. He thought about federal prison, probably. They'd charge him with murder, multiple counts, premeditated, life without parole if he was lucky, death penalty if the prosecution pushed hard enough. He was 48 years old. Even if they gave him life, he'd die in a cell. Never see Marie again except through plexiglass during visiting hours. Never see his grandchildren when they eventually came. Never work these waters at dawn, breathing salt air that smelled like home. All of that gone, for a crab trap, for $40 worth of wire and rope, for the principle that a man doesn't let himself be robbed. He could stop, could call Marcel Thibodeau right now, say forget it, let bygones be bygones, could drive to the Marine Patrol office tomorrow, file a proper report, let the law handle it like Marie wanted. Might take months, might not go anywhere, but at least he'd stay free, stay home. But then he thought about standing in that empty water, staring at the space where his trap should have been, thought about 2 years of work and $40 vanishing in one night, thought about Marcel's face when he'd said, "Don't know nothing about your trap." The lie so casual, so easy, like Jean-Baptiste's livelihood meant nothing. Thought about his sons watching, learning what their father did when someone crossed him. No. Some things mattered more than freedom, more than life itself. Honor, respect. The lesson that actions had consequences. Jean-Baptiste reassembled the rifle, loaded 5 rounds into the magazine, and set it aside. Then he started on Jerome's shotgun. There was no turning back now. Saturday morning, August 14th, 1982, dawned clear and humid, the sun rising over the Louisiana Delta like it had done every morning since the beginning of time, indifferent to human plans, human anger, human justice. Jean-Baptiste woke at 4:30 like always, made his coffee, sat on his porch, smoked his 2 cigarettes. Everything the same as every other morning, except for the rifles wrapped in canvas on his kitchen table, and the knowledge that by this time tomorrow, he'd either be in jail or dead. At 6:47 a.m., Jerome arrived first, parking his truck beside his father's in the shell driveway. He came inside without knocking, saw the weapons, the nautical charts still spread across the table, the boxes of ammunition stacked neatly beside them. "Today?" Jerome asked. "Today. You sure about this?" Jean-Baptiste looked up at his oldest son. Jerome was 30 years old, had a wife who loved him, and 2 young children who needed him. He could still walk away. Should walk away. "You don't have to be part of this," Jean-Baptiste said. "I can do it alone." Jerome pulled out a chair, sat down across from his father. "You remember when I was 8 and those Guidry boys jumped me after school? Beat me so bad I couldn't see out of my right eye for a week. Jean-Baptiste remembered. He'd been working offshore then, had found Jerome crying on the dock when he came home. You remember what you did? Jerome continued. I took care of it. You put both of them in the hospital. Their daddy threatened to press charges. But you did it anyway because that's what family does. They don't let people hurt their own and walk away. Jerome stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the bayou where morning fog was starting to burn off. Paul asked me yesterday if we were really going through with this. I told him yes. The Thibodeaux crossed our family, and family doesn't let that slide, not in these waters. Jean-Baptiste felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. He'd been prepared to do this alone, had been ready to carry it all himself, but having Jerome beside him, it made the weight bearable. All right then, Jean-Baptiste said. We do this together. They spent the next 2 hours going over the plan. Who would be at the Thibodeaux camp? Marcel for sure, plus his 4 sons and maybe a few cousins who sometimes worked with them. The layout of their operation, spread across 3 boats and a floating camp built on oil drums and cypress planking. The weapons, Jean-Baptiste's rifle, Jerome's shotgun, the pistols they'd distribute to the others when everyone arrived. At 8:15 a.m., Antoine showed up, then Michel, then Philippe. The nephews came in 2 trucks, all of them armed, all of them understanding what they were about to become. They stood in the kitchen, 9 men who'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, waiting for their patriarch to give the order that would transform them from fishermen into something else entirely. Jean-Baptiste stood up, looked at his sons and nephews, men he'd raised to believe in family loyalty above all else. Boys, we all know why we're here. The Thibodeaux stole from us, disrespected us, and when I gave them a chance to make it right, they spit in my face. That's not something we can let stand. What about the law? Philippe asked quietly. What about calling the Marine Patrol? The law's 40 miles away, Jean-Baptiste said. By the time they get here, file paperwork. If they even care about a missing crab trap, the Thibodeaux will have sold our equipment and moved on to stealing from someone else. No, this gets settled the old way, the way our grandfathers would have settled it. He looked around the room. Anyone who wants to walk away, now's the time. No shame in it. This is going to change everything. Once we do this, there's no going back. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The bond between them, forged in childhood and hardened by years of working dangerous waters together, held firm. We're with you, Dad, Jerome said. All of us. Jean-Baptiste nodded. Then let's finish this. They loaded the boats at 9:30 a.m., 3 vessels, the Marie Claire carrying Jean-Baptiste, Jerome, and Antoine. The smaller boat, Acadiana, with Michel, Philippe, and nephew Louis. The third boat, a flat-bottom skiff called Jolie Blonde, with the remaining nephews Robert, Charles, and Paul. Each boat armed with enough firepower to eliminate every person at the Thibodeaux camp twice over. The morning was perfect for what they intended. Fog still hung in patches across the water, providing cover. The tide was incoming, which would help them navigate the shallow channels near the Thibodeaux operation. Most importantly, it was Saturday, which meant the waters would be busy with weekend fishermen and recreational boaters, providing background noise and distraction. At 10:15 a.m., they left Jean-Baptiste's dock in formation, 3 boats carrying 9 armed men toward a confrontation that would leave 21 people dead before sunset. The sound of their engines echoed across the marsh as they disappeared into the maze of channels that would take them to their targets. While the Boudreaux convoy moved through the Louisiana Delta, Marcel Thibodeaux was having coffee with his oldest son André at their floating camp near Passaloutre. They were discussing the day's work, where to set their nets, whether the weather would hold. Normal Saturday morning conversation between father and son, completely unaware that 9 men with rifles were navigating the backwaters toward them, completely unaware that they had maybe 6 hours left to live. The preparation had taken Jean-Baptiste 3 days. The actual execution would take less than 12 hours. By the time the sun set on August 14, 1982, the worst maritime massacre in Louisiana history would be complete, 21 families would be destroyed, and the name Boudreaux would be synonymous with the kind of violence that erupts when honor matters more than law, when family loyalty becomes family destruction, when the old ways of settling disputes collide with the modern world in the darkness of America's forgotten waterways. The first shots would be fired at 11:47 a.m. The last body would float face down in Barataria Bay at 6:22 p.m., and in between those two moments, the Louisiana marshes would witness systematic elimination carried out with the precision of men who knew these waters better than any law enforcement agency, who understood that in the remote fishing camps scattered through the Delta, justice was whatever you could enforce with your own hands and your own weapons. But as the three Boudreaux boats moved deeper into the marsh that Saturday morning, as the fog began to burn off and the temperature climbed toward 90 degrees, none of the men aboard had any idea how far they were about to fall, how completely they would destroy not just their enemies but themselves, their families, their futures. They only knew that someone had stolen from them, that the law couldn't help, and that in the Louisiana Delta of 1982, some debts could only be paid in blood. The radio in Jean-Baptiste's boat crackled with weather reports and fishing chatter. Normal Saturday morning on the water. Normal life continuing while 9 men carried death toward 21 others who had no idea what was coming. The sun climbed higher. The fog cleared. And somewhere ahead in the maze of channels and bayous, Marcel Thibodeau and his sons went about their business, unaware that their time was running out 1 minute at a time, 1 nautical mile at a time. One decision at a time that couldn't be undone. At 11:47 a.m. on August 14, 1982, 3 boats carrying 9 armed men emerged from the fog bank that had concealed their approach and found themselves 200 yards from the Thibodeau floating camp. The temperature had climbed to 87 degrees, humidity so thick it felt like breathing through wet cloth. The camp sat anchored in a protected cove off Pass Loutre. 3 aluminum boats tied to a platform built from oil drums and weathered cypress planking. Smoke rose from a small cook stove where someone was preparing lunch. Through the heat shimmer, Jean-Baptiste could see figures moving on the platform, men going about their Saturday routine, completely unaware that death was closing the distance at 15 knots. Jean-Baptiste raised his hand, the signal he'd used in countless hunting expeditions with his sons. The 3 boats spread into attack formation, Marie Claire approaching from the north, Acadiana from the east, Jolie Blonde cutting off any escape route to the south. Military precision learned from stories his father had told about the Pacific Theater, adapted for the Louisiana marshes where law enforcement was 40 miles away, and help would arrive too late to matter. Marcel Thibodeau stood on the platform, coffee cup in one hand, pointing toward a channel where he'd seen jumping fish earlier that morning. His 4 sons clustered around him, André, Louis, Paul, and the youngest, Michel, barely 17 years old. 2 cousins, Jacques and Bernard, had joined them for the weekend, bringing the total to 7 men who at that moment were discussing whether to move their operation to deeper water or work the shallows where the smaller crabs were running. The sound of approaching engines didn't alarm them initially. Saturday mornings brought recreational fishermen, shrimpers heading to their grounds, Coast Guard patrols checking on commercial operations. Normal maritime traffic in waters that belonged to everyone and no one. But as the boats got closer, something about their formation, their purposeful approach, made André look up from the chart he'd been studying. "Dad," André said quietly, "those boats are coming straight for us." Marcel turned, shielded his eyes against the morning glare, watched 3 vessels converging on their position with mechanical precision. Recognition came slowly, then all at once. The lead boat, Marie Claire, carried a figure he knew well, Jean-Baptiste Boudreaux, standing in the bow like some avenging patriarch, rifle visible in his hands. "Oh, Jesus," Marcel whispered, understanding flooding through him like ice water. The crab trap. This was about the goddamn crab trap. "What is it?" André asked, but Marcel was already moving, shouting orders that came too late and mattered too little. "Get the guns!" Marcel screamed, his voice cracking with sudden terror. "Get the rifles from the boat! Move!" But there was nowhere to move. The platform sat anchored in open water, exposed from every direction. The Thibodeau boats were tied up, engines cold, no chance of starting them and escaping before the Boudreaux convoy closed the distance. 7 men trapped on floating wood and metal, realizing in the space of 30 seconds that they were about to die for something they'd convinced themselves didn't matter. At 11:49 a.m., Jean-Baptiste's voice carried across the water, amplified by the strange acoustics of the marsh where sound traveled with perfect clarity. "Marcel Thibodeau, you had your chance. Should have returned what you stole." The first shot came from Jerome's 12-gauge, fired from 40 yards as the Marie Claire closed the final distance. The blast echoed across the water like thunder, sending birds exploding from the marsh grass in all directions. André Thibodeau, 28 years old, father of 2 young children, spun around and fell backward off the platform. His body hit the water with a splash that seemed too small for a human life ending. What followed wasn't a fight, wasn't a gun battle between equals. It was systematic elimination carried out by men who'd planned every angle, every position, every escape route. The Thibodeau men had 3 hunting rifles on their boats, but they were stored in gun cases, unloaded, secured for transport rather than combat. By the time Jacques Thibodeau reached the first weapon, Antoine Boudreau's .30-06 had already found him. The bullet took him center mass, lifting him off his feet and sending him tumbling into the dark water that would become his grave. Marcel tried to surrender, raising his hands, shouting that he'd pay for the trap, that he'd make it right, that this had gone too far. But Jean-Baptiste's face showed no emotion, no mercy, no recognition that these were men he'd known for decades. The transformation was complete. The fisherman was gone, replaced by something colder, something necessary. "Your word meant nothing when I gave you the chance," Jean-Baptiste said, his voice carrying across 20 yards of open water. Too late for talking now. The rifle barked once. Marcel Thibodeau fell beside his sons, blood spreading across weathered planking that had supported 3 generations of fishermen. The platform rocked gently in the wash from the boats, creaking with the weight of the dead. Louis Thibodeau, 24 years old, tried to dive under the platform, thinking maybe he could hide beneath the floating structure until the shooting stopped. Philippe Boudreau tracked him through the water, the youngest member of the execution squad carrying out his assigned role with mechanical precision. The shot came when Louis surfaced for air 30 yards away, desperate and gasping and believing for one moment he might survive. The water turned red around him before he disappeared beneath the surface for the last time. Paul Thibodeau, barely 19, stood frozen in the center of the platform, too terrified to move, too young to understand that movement wouldn't have mattered anyway. He looked directly at Jean-Baptiste, tears streaming down his face, and spoke the last words anyone would ever hear him say. "Please, Mr. Boudreau, I got a girlfriend. We're gonna get married next month. Please." Jean-Baptiste felt something crack inside his chest, a hairline fracture in the ice that had formed around his heart. The boy was younger than Philippe, had his whole life ahead of him, had done nothing except be born into the wrong family. But the code was absolute. No witnesses, no survivors, no loose ends that could unravel everything they'd built. "Should have thought about that before your family stole from mine," Jean-Baptiste said quietly, then pulled the trigger. At 11:58 a.m., 7 members of the Thibodeau family lay dead on and around their floating camp. Blood mixed with bilge water and coffee from the overturned cup Marcel had been holding when the shooting started. The platform rocked gently in the current, empty now except for the dead and the flies that had already begun to gather despite the morning heat. But Jean-Baptiste's information had been incomplete. What he didn't know was that the Thibodeau operation extended beyond the immediate family. 3 more boats were working the channels nearby, carrying relatives and hired help who'd joined the family business for the weekend. Uncle Remy Thibodeau with his 2 adult sons, Cousin Gerard with 3 men from Bourras who needed work. A total of 8 more people who at that moment were hauling nets 2 miles away, unaware that their family had just been wiped out. The sound of gunfire carried across the marsh, echoing off the water and through the channels in ways that made it impossible to determine direction or distance. But Remy Thibodeau, 54 years old, Marcel's older brother, recognized the sharp crack of high-powered rifles. He'd served 2 tours in Vietnam, knew the difference between hunting shots and combat, knew that 7 rapid-fire rifle reports meant something had gone catastrophically wrong. Remy grabbed his marine radio, tried to raise Marcel on channel 16. Static answered him. He tried channel 9, the frequency they used for family communications. More static. Finally, he switched to channel 22, the emergency frequency monitored by the Coast Guard. Coast Guard, this is fishing vessel Marie-Therese. We got shots fired near Pass Loutre. Multiple shots. Can't raise my brother's boat. Something's wrong out here. The transmission went out at 12:03 p.m., 5 minutes after the massacre at the floating camp. By the time Coast Guard Station Grand Isle responded, asking for coordinates and additional information, the Boudreau boats were already moving toward their next targets, following a plan that called for complete elimination of everyone connected to the theft of one $40 crab trap. Jean-Baptiste had known about the extended family operation, had spent 3 days gathering intelligence, tracking movements, identifying every boat and every person who might pose a threat or serve as a witness. This wasn't rage, this wasn't passion, this was systematic elimination planned with the thoroughness of a military operation and carried out with the patience of men who'd spent their lives hunting in these waters. At 12:15 p.m., the 3 Boudreaux boats found Remy Thibodeau's vessel anchored near a shallow reef where the older man had been working crab lines with his sons Thomas and David, 26 and 24 years old respectively, both married, both fathers of young children who would grow up without knowing their fathers, except through photographs and the stories their mothers would tell them about good men who died for reasons that made no sense. Remy saw them coming and knew immediately what had happened at Marcel's camp. He'd lived through enough combat to recognize the approach of armed men with deadly intent. But unlike his younger brother, Remy was prepared to fight back. He'd kept his M16 from Vietnam, modified for hunting but still capable of putting down multiple targets with military efficiency. "You boys get behind the engine block," Remy told his sons, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. "This is about to get ugly." The firefight that followed lasted 7 minutes and could be heard from 3 miles away. Remy Thibodeau was a trained soldier, knew how to use cover, how to make every shot count. His sons had grown up hunting these marshes, understood angles and distances, and how to lead moving targets. But they were 3 men with hunting rifles facing 9 attackers in 3 boats with overlapping fields of fire and no concern for their own safety. Antoine Boudreaux took a bullet through the shoulder from Remy's rifle, the impact spinning him around and sending him crashing into the bottom of Acadiana. Blood spread across his shirt, dark and wet, but the wound wasn't fatal. Philippe grabbed his cousin, applied pressure to the wound, kept him conscious while the battle continued around them. "We got one down," Philippe shouted to his father. "How bad?" Jean-Baptiste called back, never taking his eyes off the enemy boat. "He'll live, but he needs a hospital." "No hospitals," Jean-Baptiste said. "Not until this is finished." Thomas Thibodeau died trying to reload his father's rifle, taking a shotgun blast from Michel Boudreaux that lifted him out of the boat and into water that immediately turned red around his body. David died 30 seconds later, cut down by crossfire from 2 different boats as he attempted to reach his father's position. Remy fought alone for the final 3 minutes, moving from position to position on his boat, making the Boudreaux men pay for every yard they gained. He wounded 2 more attackers, put a bullet through the windshield of Marie Claire that missed Jean-Baptiste by 6 inches, held them off long enough to make one final radio transmission. "They killed Marcel," Remy's voice cracked over the emergency frequency. "The Boudreaux family. They're killing all of us. Send help. Send the Coast Guard. Send somebody." The transmission cut off when Jerome's 12-gauge found its target. Remy Thibodeau, Vietnam veteran, father of 2, died clutching his rifle and cursing the names of men he'd known his entire life, men who'd transformed into something unrecognizable in pursuit of what they called justice. At 12:22 p.m., 10 members of the Thibodeau family lay dead across 2 crime scenes. The floating camp drifted in the current, its anchor chains severed by gunfire, carrying 7 bodies toward the open Gulf. 3 more bodies floated near the reef where Remy had made his final stand, blood mixed with salt water and diesel fuel, creating slicks that would drift for miles before finally dispersing. But the killing wasn't over. Gerard Thibodeau and his 3 hired men were still working nets near Baie Ronquille, unaware that their family had been eliminated, unaware that 9 armed men were hunting them through channels they'd known since childhood. The radio chatter had been too garbled to understand, the distance too great to hear the gunfire clearly. They continued their work, hauling in the day's catch, making plans for the evening, living the last minutes of their lives in complete ignorance of what was coming. The sun climbed higher, temperature reaching 91 degrees, humidity making every breath feel like drowning in warm air. Somewhere in the distance, Coast Guard boats were responding to Remy's final transmission, racing through channels toward coordinates that would lead them to bodies and blood and the worst maritime crime scene in Louisiana history, but they were still 30 minutes away, 30 minutes too late to save anyone, 30 minutes too late to stop Jean-Baptiste Boudreaux from completing his mission of total elimination. The Marie Claire led the hunt for the final boat, Jean-Baptiste standing in the bow like some ancient warrior, rifle ready, eyes scanning the maze of channels for any sign of movement. Behind him, Antoine sat propped against the engine housing, Philippe applying pressure to his wounded shoulder, blood seeping between his cousin's fingers despite the makeshift bandage. "We need to get him to a hospital, Dad," Philippe said quietly. "He's losing too much blood." "After," Jean-Baptiste said without turning around. "We finish this first, then we deal with the wounded." But Antoine was conscious, alert enough to understand what his uncle meant by finishing this. 4 more men had to die before anyone could receive medical attention. 4 more families had to be destroyed before the debt was considered paid. The mathematics of vengeance, calculated in blood and justified by a code that made perfect sense to men who'd grown up believing honor mattered more than law. At 12:41 p.m., they found Gerard Thibodeau, D. Thibodeau. The final boat sat anchored in a narrow channel between 2 spoil banks, hidden from the main waterway by a curtain of marsh grass that had grown 15 feet tall in the rich delta soil. Gerard Thibodeau, 41 years old, Marcel's cousin, worked alongside 3 men from Bourras who'd needed weekend work to feed their families. Jimmy Guidry, 33, father of 4, Robert Melançon, 28, recently married, Eddie Broussard, 35, whose wife was pregnant with their first child. None of them knew that their names had been written on Jean-Baptiste's list 3 days ago. None of them understood that they'd been marked for elimination simply because they'd chosen to work with the wrong family on the wrong weekend. They pulled nets heavy with blue crabs, sorting through the catch, throwing back the females and undersized males, keeping only what the law allowed and the market would buy. Normal Saturday work, honest labor, men trying to make a living from waters that had sustained their families for generations. Gerard heard the engines first, 3 boats approaching from the south where the channel opened into Bay Ronquille. He looked up from the sorting table, shielded his eyes against the midday glare, watched the familiar silhouettes of local fishing boats heading in his direction. Nothing unusual about that. Saturday brought heavy traffic on the water, commercial fishermen working alongside weekend sportsmen, everyone trying to find their piece of the Gulf's bounty. But something about the formation bothered him. The purposeful approach, the way they moved in coordination rather than independently. Gerard had spent enough time on these waters to recognize when boats were hunting versus fishing, when men had deadly intent versus peaceful purpose. "Y'all see them boats?" Gerard asked quietly, not wanting to alarm his crew but unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. Jimmy Guidry looked up from the crab basket he'd been sorting. "What about them?" "They're coming straight for us, moving like they got business." Robert Melançon straightened up, studied the approaching vessels. He'd grown up in these marshes, understood the subtle language of boat movement, the way experienced watermen could read intent from a mile away. "That's the Boudreaux boats," he said, recognition dawning in his voice. "Marie Claire, Acadiana, Jolie Blonde. Why they running together like that?" Gerard felt ice forming in his stomach. He'd heard the radio chatter earlier, garbled transmissions about shots fired near Pass a Loutre, emergency calls that cut off mid-sentence. He'd dismissed it as equipment malfunction, atmospheric interference that made communication difficult on busy weekends. Now he understood it had been something else entirely. "Where's your radio?" Gerard asked Jimmy, his voice tight with sudden urgency. "In the cabin. Why? What's wrong?" But Gerard was already moving, climbing over crab baskets and fishing equipment toward the small wheelhouse where Jimmy kept his marine radio. His hands shook as he switched to Channel 16, the emergency frequency monitored by Coast Guard stations throughout the Gulf. Coast Guard, this is fishing vessel St. Joseph. We got 3 boats approaching our position in Bay Ronquille. Something ain't right. Need immediate assistance." Static answered him. He tried again, adjusted the antenna, increased the power. Nothing but electronic noise and the distant chatter of other fishermen working different areas. Either his radio was malfunctioning or something was jamming the frequency. Either way, help wasn't coming. At 12:47 p.m., the 3 Boudreaux boats closed to within 100 yards. Gerard could see Jean-Baptiste clearly now, standing in the bow of Marie Claire like some biblical patriarch delivering judgment. Could see the rifles, the grim faces of men who'd already crossed lines they could never uncross. Could see blood on Antoine's shirt where he sat propped against the engine housing, wounded but alive, proof that the morning had already turned violent. "Gerard Thibodeau." Jean-Baptiste's voice carried across the water with perfect clarity. "You know why we're here." Gerard did know. The missing crab trap, Marcel's refusal to admit taking it, the ultimatum that had expired at sunset the day before. What he didn't know was how a $40 piece of equipment had escalated into armed confrontation, how a simple theft had transformed his cousin's family into targets for elimination. "Jean-Baptiste," Gerard called back, stepping to the rail of his boat. "Whatever this is about, we can work it out. No need for weapons." "Time for working it out was yesterday," Jean-Baptiste replied. "Your family made their choice. Now you live with the consequences." The first shot came without warning, Michel Boudreau's rifle speaking from the bow of Jolie Blonde. The bullet punched through the aluminum hull of St. Joseph 6 inches above the waterline, the metallic clang echoing across the marsh. Warning shot or poor marksmanship, Gerard couldn't tell, but he understood the message clearly enough. "Get down!" he screamed to his crew. "Find cover! They mean to kill us!" What followed was chaos compressed into minutes that felt like hours. 4 men with no weapons except fillet knives and gaff hooks facing 9 attackers with military-style rifles and tactical coordination. Jimmy Guidry tried to start the engine, thinking maybe they could run for open water, escape into the maze of channels where local knowledge might give them an advantage. The starter clicked uselessly. Battery too weak or engine too cold or simple mechanical failure at the worst possible moment. Robert Melançon grabbed the marine radio, tried to broadcast their position, call for help from anyone listening. "Mayday, Mayday! This is St. Joseph in Bay Ronquille. We're under attack. Multiple armed men. Send help immediately." The transmission cut off when Jerome's shotgun blast shattered the wheelhouse window, sending glass and electronic components flying in all directions. Eddie Broussard, whose wife was 7 months pregnant with their first child, did the only thing that made sense to a man facing certain death. He dove overboard, thinking maybe he could swim to the marsh grass, hide in the shallows until the shooting stopped, somehow survive to see his child born. The water was warm, nearly as warm as the air, but it offered no protection from men who'd been hunting these marshes their entire lives. Philippe Boudreau tracked Eddie through the water with mechanical precision, leading the target the way his father had taught him to lead swimming ducks during hunting season. The shot came when Eddie surfaced for air 40 yards from the boat, gasping and desperate and believing for one moment he might live to hold his son or daughter. The bullet took him in the back of the head. Eddie Broussard disappeared beneath the surface without another sound, his body sinking into water that would carry him toward the Gulf of Mexico, toward depths where the crabs and fish would finish what the rifle had started. His wife would wait until midnight for him to come home, would call the Marine Patrol at dawn, would learn 3 days later that she was a widow carrying a child who would never know his father's face. On the boat, Gerard and his remaining crew members faced the mathematics of inevitable death. No weapons, no escape route, no help coming from authorities who were still 20 miles away and struggling to coordinate response to multiple crime scenes scattered across hundreds of square miles of coastal marsh. 3 men against 9, desperation against preparation, hunting knives against military rifles. The outcome was predetermined, but Gerard Thibodeau had been raised in these waters, taught by his father and grandfather that a man fought back regardless of odds, that you didn't go quietly even when going quietly might buy you a few extra minutes of life. He grabbed a gaff hook, 6 feet of aluminum and steel, normally used for landing large fish, and prepared to make the Boudreau family pay for every yard they gained. "Jimmy, Robert, find something to fight with," Gerard shouted. "We ain't going down without a fight." But Jimmy Guidry was already down, cut down by crossfire from 2 different boats as he tried to reach the toolbox where he kept emergency flares. Father of 4, dead at 33, his body sprawled across crab baskets that would never be emptied, never sorted, never sold at the dock where his children waited for him to come home with money for groceries and school clothes. Robert Melançon lasted 30 seconds longer, using the engine housing as cover while he tried to reach the fillet knife strapped to his belt. Recently married, honeymooning in installments between fishing trips because they couldn't afford a real vacation, planning to buy a house in Barras where they could raise children and build a life together. The bullet that ended those plans came from Jean-Baptiste's rifle, fired with the same precision he'd used to put deer meat on his family's table for 3 decades. At 12:53 p.m., Gerard Thibodeau stood alone on the deck of St. Joseph, surrounded by the bodies of 3 good men who'd done nothing except work for the wrong family on the wrong day, blood mixed with salt water and diesel fuel, creating patterns that would drift across the marsh for days before finally dispersing. The gaff hook felt useless in his hands, aluminum and steel against military rifles, desperation against cold purpose. "You killed them all," Gerard said, his voice breaking with grief and rage. "4 good men with families, children who'll grow up without fathers. For what? A goddamn crab trap worth $40? For respect," Jean-Baptiste replied, his rifle aimed at Gerard's chest from 30 yards away. "For the lesson that you don't steal from a man's family and walk away. For making sure this never happens again. You're insane, all of you. This ain't justice. This is massacre. Call it whatever you want. Your family crossed the line. Now you pay the price." Gerard raised the gaff hook, not because he thought it would save him, but because dying with a weapon in his hands felt better than dying on his knees. "Then get it over with. But know this, Jean-Baptiste. You ain't making yourself into some kind of hero. You're making yourself into the devil, and devils burn in hell." The rifle barked once. Gerard Thibodeau fell backward into the wheelhouse, the gaff hook clattering across aluminum decking, joining the silence that had settled over Baie Ronquille like morning fog. 14 members of the Thibodeau family and their associates now lay dead across 4 crime scenes scattered through the Louisiana marshes. 14 families destroyed, 14 futures erased, 14 children who would grow up asking why their fathers never came home. But the killing wasn't finished. Jean-Baptiste's list contained one more name, one final target that had to be eliminated before the debt could be considered paid in full. Marcel Thibodeau had a brother-in-law, Paul Hebert, who worked independent contracts but sometimes shared information with the Thibodeau operation. Who might have known about the missing crab trap, might have been involved in its theft, might serve as a witness who could identify the Boudreaux boats if he lived to talk to investigators. At 1:17 p.m., while Coast Guard cutters raced through shipping channels toward coordinates that would lead them to the worst maritime crime scene in Louisiana history, the 3 Boudreaux boats turned south toward Hackberry Bay, where Paul Hebert worked alone in waters so remote that his screams would never be heard by anyone except the birds and the crabs and the endless marsh grass that had witnessed 1,000 years of violence and would witness 1,000 years more. The temperature had climbed to 93 degrees. Antoine Boudreaux had lost so much blood that his skin looked like old newspaper, gray and translucent, but he remained conscious, alert enough to understand that one more man had to die before anyone could seek medical attention. The mathematics of vengeance, written in blood across the Louisiana Delta, calculated in lives that meant nothing to men who'd decided honor mattered more than humanity. Paul Hebert worked alone that Saturday afternoon, his 22-foot aluminum boat anchored in the shallow waters of Hackberry Bay, where the tide pools collected blue crabs seeking refuge from the deeper channels. 51 years old, weathered by 3 decades of Louisiana sun and salt spray, Paul had chosen solitude over crew because the margins were too thin to split profits with hired help. His wife had died 2 years earlier from complications during routine surgery, leaving him with medical bills that consumed every dollar he could scrape from the Gulf. The bay stretched around him like a mirror, reflecting clouds and sky and water so still it seemed solid. Cypress trees draped with Spanish moss lined the distant shore, their roots disappearing into dark water that had sustained his family since his great-grandfather first pulled a pirogue through these channels in 1923. Paul hummed old Cajun songs while he worked, melodies his father had taught him, words in French that fewer and fewer people understood anymore. He'd heard radio chatter earlier, emergency transmissions that cut through static before dissolving into electronic noise. Coast Guard frequencies carried fragments of distress calls, coordinates that meant nothing to him, urgent voices requesting assistance in areas he rarely worked. Paul had dismissed it as routine maritime drama, the kind of mechanical failures and minor accidents that happened every weekend when recreational boaters ventured beyond their experience. His crab baskets held a decent morning's catch, enough to cover fuel costs and put food on his table, maybe even enough to make a small payment toward the medical debt that followed him like a persistent shadow. Blue crabs scuttled across the bottom of his boat, their claws bound with rubber bands, their shells gleaming in afternoon sunlight that felt like standing inside an oven. At 1:29 p.m., Paul heard engines approaching from the north, 3 boats running in formation across water that amplified every mechanical sound for miles. He looked up from the crab basket he'd been sorting, shielded his eyes against the glare, watched familiar silhouettes cutting through the heat shimmer. The Boudreaux boats, running together like they had business somewhere urgent. Paul raised his hand in greeting, the automatic gesture of fishermen acknowledging each other on open water. But something about their approach troubled him, the way they moved with military precision rather than the casual wandering of men following fish. The lead boat, Marie Claire, carried a figure in the bow that Paul recognized as Jean-Baptiste Boudreau, but the man's posture was wrong, too rigid, too focused, like a hunter who'd spotted his quarry. Recognition hit Paul like cold water. These weren't fishermen anymore. These were men who'd already crossed lines, already made choices that couldn't be undone. The radio chatter he'd dismissed suddenly made terrible sense. Emergency transmissions, distress calls, coordinates marking places where violence had erupted in waters that had known peace for generations. Paul's hand moved toward his marine radio, muscle memory from 30 years of working alone in dangerous waters. But before he could key the microphone, Jean-Baptiste's voice carried across the closing distance with deadly clarity. By 6:22 p.m. on August 14, 1982, 21 men lay dead across the Louisiana marshes, their blood mixing with salt water and diesel fuel in patterns that would drift toward the Gulf of Mexico and eventually disappear. Jean-Baptiste Boudreau and his family had settled their debt over a $40 crab trap with systematic violence that destroyed not just their enemies, but themselves, their futures, and everyone connected to both families. The mathematics of vengeance had been calculated in blood, and when federal agents finally arrived at the crime scenes scattered across hundreds of square miles of coastal wetlands, they found evidence of the most brutal maritime massacre in American history. All for honor, all for respect, all for the principle that in forgotten corners of America, where law enforcement was too far away to matter, some debts could only be paid with death.